So without further ado, please welcome Charles Waldhein.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, that's among the more robust rounds of applause I've had recently, and it's for just driving for a few hours. I had a lovely day, I have to say. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation and for all your hospitality. It already has a sense of occasion to me. So I don't know what it is you would like to talk about. I'm open to talking with you about what's on your minds. I did prepare some material about what I thought might be interesting. And so to start with, what I was going to say is just a little bit autobiographical, and I apologize for that because it's not really about me, but I want to situate why I'm here and what I'm working on. So I'm an architect. I have had a lifelong interest and a professional interest in cities, and it became clear to me in graduate school, in doing my MArch, knowing that I wanted to pursue an academic career and pursue research, but looking at the American city, I'm from the South, for me looking at the American city was really an important focus for the beginning of my career. Now I was hindered by the fact that having grown up in the South, I thought Atlanta was a real city, and so I mistook that, and it took me a while to unpack that. And I had this experience in graduate school, kind of deep into my sixth year of architectural education, that was a little bit puzzling to me. As I was reading about the contemporary city, the American city, if I was to read, this would have been in the late 80s, early 90s, if I were to read American authors about the American city, architects, urbanists, they would generally say it's all sorted out, just look at Europe. We have Paris and Rome, and we're simply immature. We simply haven't quite gotten there yet. We just need a few more centuries. It's all fine. And at the exact same moment, if I were to read European urbanists, architects, they said, forget Europe, it's over. To understand the American city, to understand the contemporary city around the world, you have to unpack landscape. And I was underprepared for this. I had not read a book about landscape. I had never attended a lecture. I'd never taken a course. I had no idea what it meant, because in my training as an architect, I was told that the landscapers were those people that wore Birkenstocks and used kind of magic markers and dealt with plants. And by the way, don't talk to them, right? In the end, I had been misinformed. And so that piqued my curiosity, and I happened to have been in a place, I happened to have been in a school where they had a program in landscape architecture, and so I started talking to them. You know, I went across the aisle and I started talking to people and attending lectures and reading a little bit, with the idea of trying to understand what landscape was as a medium, so as to be able to better understand the American city. You guys are more than welcome to hang out there on the periphery, but there are a few seats down here if you want to climb in. And so that began a process of essentially kind of radicalization, you know, in working at the beginning of my academic career, working on the American city and thinking of landscape as a way to understand it. And by European urbanists, I mean people like Kenneth Frampton, people like Rem Koolhaas, people like Lars Lerup, people like Jim Corner. While they're very, very different people, they share a certain set of characteristics in the sense that they were all architect urbanists trained at one time, interested in the contemporary city. And for all of them at a moment in time in the early 90s, landscape became a lens through which to understand the contemporary city. And so my work has really grown out of that, and over the last several years, we've been talking more and more about an ecological urbanism. So an ecological urbanism, which is the primary project for us at the GSD just now, my colleague Mohsen Mustafavi and I and others, is really a continuation of the project of landscape urbanism, but by more precise terms, right? If we knew then what we know now, if we knew in the late 90s, turn of the 21st century, we could say really what we mean is ecology as a lens to understand the city, and also ecology as a kind of operating system. And so I'll use terms like lens as a way of seeing. You know, if you read Lars Lerup on Houston or Rem Koolhaas on Atlanta, they're using landscape as a way to describe the city, as a metaphor. But if you also look at the work of others, you'll find landscape as being used as a medium of design, right? And then ultimately for me, more recently, under this rubric of ecological urbanism, I'll say things like the landscape architect is the urbanist of our age, you know? And this happens to be a particular historical moment. I think that disproportionately, if you're building a city today, if you need an urban theory or an urban model, you're more than likely than not going to retain the services of a landscape architect to lead a very complex urban project. And this has primarily to do with the ascendancy of ecology as a way of thinking about the city or as a way of thinking about the world. You guys with me so far? I mean, I apologize for the backstory, but I thought it might make a little bit more sense because I'm not really a landscape architect. You know, it's not what I studied. I was one of you guys, you know, and it took me a while to understand the landscape's relevance for these topics. So I've been doing a little bit of work recently looking into this in a slightly longer historical arc. So if landscape urbanism in the last 15 years claims that the landscape architect is the urbanist of our age, I think that's true. What we could also say is it's the third time in the last 2 centuries that landscape has played that role. At least 3 times in the last 2 centuries, landscape has come to the fore for thinking through the city. And most often, this correlates with very abrupt changes in the industrial economy that shape cities. My working theory, my working idea right now is that landscape is much more flexible and fluid in responding to economic changes and to the social and environmental challenges associated with changes in the economy of cities. The first such moment that landscape appeared in this way, I would argue, would be with the rise of the industrial city itself and the invention of landscape architecture as a field. Right? So you'll recall that landscape architecture was invented in a conversation between Paris and New York in the second half of the 19th century, and then it was first fully embodied here in the US by a professional association, a license, a degree program at Harvard, the first of its kind in the world, et cetera, a journal. All of the elements of professionalization occurred on the eastern seaboard of the US at the end of the 19th century. And so in that context, I've been interested to ask a kind of naive question, which as an architect, I feel like I can afford to ask kind of naive, dumb questions. Like, in that formulation, what was the first work of landscape architecture? If it's not gardening, right? What was the first? So this is an interactive portion of the evening. What do you think? What was the first work of a landscape architect in the context of North America, in the formation of the new profession? Savannah. What else? What do you think? Central Park. Thank you. It is on the slide up here. I had been led to believe, in my faulty education, that Central Park was the first work of a landscape architect as such. Right? And I had been led to believe that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. had in fact signed drawings, landscape architect, complete fiction. In agreeing to work as the superintendent of the Central Park, having been, down on his luck, his publishing venture had failed, he was not a great farmer. He was a consequential journalist, but Olmsted ultimately was down on his luck and really was about to go into debt and took a civil service job as the superintendent of the Central Park. He consolidated his political base very rapidly. He advocated for a public design competition. He partnered with one of the best architects in the country, in Calvert Vaux at the time, and then won the design competition along a strictly, bless you, party line vote, 5-4, being a good reform Republican. I don't want to diminish the origin myth at all, but I want to situate it historically and politically. In none of that, not in winning the design competition, in beginning construction, in none of that did Olmsted use the term landscape architect. He called himself an architect. This was much to the chagrin of Calvert Vaux, who was actually an architect, but that's an aside. Upon winning the design competition, Olmsted promoted himself to architect-in-chief, which was a nice little title to have. But in none of that, there is no evidence that he ever used the term until, in 1859, deep in the construction of Central Park, the commissioners, his bosses, sent him to Europe on a kind of nervous exhaustion recovery tour, in part to regain control over the budget, which he was rapidly outpacing with the construction of Central Park. And in so doing, he toured European park precedents over the course of several months. He spent 2 weeks in Paris, during which he visited the Bois de Boulogne, Alphonse's project of haussmannisation in Paris, the closest equivalent to Central Park, 8 times. And at the Bois de Boulogne, in the office of construction, he would have seen drawings stamped Service de l'architecte paysagiste, the office of the landscape-architect. Landscape architect was a hyphenated compound identity that came out of Paris in the 19th century through the identity of people that had been trained in both landscape painting civil engineering and architecture. So I wrote a little piece about this in the Harvard Design Magazine about a year and a half ago. There's that. So what I was interested in was, why would it be that the founders of this new field decided that we needed a new field? Like, you don't invent a new profession every year, right? You don't want to have a new profession every time you have a new urban problem. But clearly, people on both sides of the Atlantic felt as though in the second half of the 19th century, we needed a new profession, that architect, engineer, artist, gardener were insufficient. And this new professional was meant to address the social, or what we'd say today is the social and environmental challenges of the industrial city, the contemporary city. In that context, it's interesting to me that they chose, the boosters of this new field, Olmsted primarily, but others, they chose to reject the longer standing tradition of landscape gardening, right? We had a perfectly good English language term, landscape gardening, in which we've had centuries of work, and it was precisely against that tradition that landscape architecture was founded. Here's the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, the royal hunting ground that had been converted ultimately into a public park. Upon his return in November of 1859, throughout the rest of his career, Olmsted would use the term landscape architect in English, beginning with his first commission as such, which was for the planning of northern Manhattan. The Commissioner's Grid of Manhattan, by that time, of course, had stretched as far as 155th Street. But the northern bit here, Washington Heights, above 155th Street, had not been planned. And so Olmsted and Vaux were commissioned in 1860, early 1860, to plan the shape of the city over Washington Heights. And so what I claim in this little essay from a year ago now is that the first commission for landscape architect was not for the design of a park, it was not for the design of a pleasure ground or promenade, it was for the shape of the city. The landscape architect was originally conceived as a new professional responsible for the shape of the city, integrating social and environmental conditions in response to the Industrial Revolution. For a whole variety of reasons that we could talk about, if you're interested in, Olmsted's plan was not executed, it was not built, but the so-called NAP plan of 1870 was. But what's significant is that retroactively, Olmsted and Vaux then apply the title landscape architect to Central Park and all of their subsequent work as a partnership, including the great, the canonical works of the 19th century, Prospect Park, the Back Bay Fens, the Franklin Park project, and other. So in its original formulation, the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard, the Master in Landscape Architecture degree program for a century, all of that, the professional rubric, was built to be a new professional responsible for the shape of the city. And the urban commitments of this new field swelled significantly after the founding of the ASLA, Robinson Hall being built in 1904 on the Harvard campus to house architecture and landscape architecture. And yet by the 1920s and 30s, the urban commitments have really kind of grown to a point that they spun off from landscape architecture an entirely new field that came to be known as planning. And once we had that split, once planning was invented and took from landscape architecture, essentially taking away our urban content, we were then left with the trivial, the decorative, the aesthetic, the plant material, right? In his final years, when asked about this, Olmsted lobbied for naming the new profession landscape architect because he felt that the greatest challenge in the future would be the so-called disalliance of landscape from architecture. That landscape needs architecture's cultural presence, its arts basis, its cultural heritage, and that in the future, Olmsted imagined there would be increasing pressure from a scientific point of view that would force landscape architects to specialize, and he was also concerned that in the public mind, they would mistake it for something to do with plants. And essentially all of those things have happened, in part because our urban content was given to another discipline. Now, at the same moment, of course, we have urban planning, we have the development of urban design in the 1950s, and what you see in the context of landscape urbanism in the last 15 years is landscape architects stepping into a void that was produced in which there were very few actors able to deal with the shape of the contemporary city anymore. And that has to do with post-1968, in certainly this culture and many cultures of the world, planners were radicalized around politics and social justice. They tended to retreat away from spatial and physical design toward policy, toward becoming more of a social science today. Urban design bet on the wrong horse. They bet on the horse of density and kind of set-piece urban destination, kind of scenography, and as a result, we're not capable of responding to the challenges in the same way, and architecture has been engaged in its own interest in autonomy. And so there was a void that began, certainly post-68, certainly by the 1970s and 80s, in which it was unclear which professional could step in and actually deal with the complexity of the contemporary city, particularly dealing with environmental issues. Given their ecological training, landscape architects stepped into that void very consequentially in the last several decades and have been able to integrate ecological thinking, ecological performance, a green position, you might say, with an understanding of design culture, for the lack of a better word. And that unique combination, ecological literacy on the one hand, but with design culture at the highest level, that intersection is, in a nutshell, the best way to think about the origins of landscape urbanism. Guys with me so far? Questions? Don't hesitate to interrupt me or throw stuff. Makes sense? I think it's true. I'm happy to have you disagree. Does that happen all the time? Is that okay? Is that normal? Beginning in the 1980s, there were a group of architect urbanists interested in avoiding the style wars of postmodernism. And we could, many of them were educated at Bedford Square, many of them at Columbia, but on both sides of the Atlantic. If you were interested in the city at a point in time, late 70s into the 1980s, but you wanted to avoid all that stylistic baggage of postmodern architecture, you might be interested in event or program. And so in that regard, we could talk about Bernard Tschumi, or in this case, Rem Koolhaas, OMA. Their entries to the Parc de la Villette competition in 81 was a kind of seminal moment when architects began to be interested in landscape again, but not for the green stuff, but rather because it could be a way to organize event or program, given both Tschumi and Koolhaas's interest in juxtaposing various aspects of city life, congestion without all the architectural containers. There was a generation following that group that were in fact trained as landscape architects. So I'm showing you here the work of Adrian Heus. Adrian is a Dutch landscape architect. His firm is called West 8. They're based in Rotterdam. And here in his Shell project in the 1990s, Adrian is doing a kind of installation on the surface of a highway, which is a part of the Dutch North Sea storm barrier. The stripes are clearly an inside reference to the OMA stripes from La Villette, so there's a cultural reference. He's doing a Venturi kind of double coating high-low game. And he's using a found material, mussel shells, which are found in abundance in the region, and he's organizing them into stripes that are black and white or dark and light, knowing that the birds in the region have been selected through predation to land on shell colors that are closer to their own feathers. Right? So Heus, trained as an ecologist at Wageningen in the Dutch ecological school, he's using ecology here not as a redemptive, moralizing, let's put nature back medium. He's using ecology, his knowledge of natural selection and Darwin, as a kind of medium of design, as a kind of public spectacle. Right? And that's typical of landscape urbanist practice in the sense that it takes ecology and it thinks about curating ecology as opposed to healing it or necessarily just putting it back. We have by now a minor canon of work. We're in what I've described as a kind of mature or middle-aged phase of this project. We're no longer fashion forward in architecture schools because in architecture you need a new thing every 18 months. At the same moment in planning, we're kind of still new and we're getting things built at this moment. And so I thought, while much of this works quite well, I thought I'd mention just briefly one or two projects. On that list, the competition for Downsview Park in Toronto at the turn of the 21st century. This is the James Corner Stan Allen entry, which is, I think, summed up the first 5 years of interest in the topic, in which they begin their project for this new piece of city making with the celebrity species, the charismatic megafauna. They identify in the moose and in the coyote and a range of other species those that are telegenic, that have funding, that have great popular appeal. They're not organizing their ecology around mosquitoes or Ebola virus, right? They're identifying species that have popular public opinion, have funding streams, and then they're engineering ecosystems around those species so as to allow them to thrive. And in diagrams like this, the landscape urbanist agenda is to, over time, organize a more flexible, indeterminate, open-ended, but also biodiverse and healthful public space than we might be able to afford to build immediately in the context of our contemporary economy. And so you see often diagrams from this phase of work like this, where at the bottom, you start in the first few years with, some birch trees and some frogs, and you can grow a bald eagle, right? But ultimately, you're building the park by growing it over time, as opposed to thinking of Central Park as a kind of set-piece construction all at once. So at this point, you're saying, okay, Waldhein, fair enough, but what does this have to do with this history of landscape planning, ecological planning? Haven't we been trying to do this for 2 centuries in terms of, haven't we been trying to plan the city relative to ecology and to landscape? And I would say, yes, of course. And so I'm showing you the cover of Ian McHarg's 1969 Design with Nature. We could talk about Carl Steinitz, we could talk about Benton McKay, we could talk about a genealogy of landscape planning. What I want to suggest to you is that the emergence of landscape planning and its growth over the course of the 20th century is really the second moment where landscape emerges as a medium of city making. The challenge here is that this interest in ecological planning, and Ian's work in particular, is necessary but insufficient for what becomes landscape urbanism. It's necessary in the sense that it gives us all the tools. It gives us the maps, the ability to develop GIS at Harvard in the 1960s, the ability to take ecological knowledge and spatialize it for organizing the shape of the city. An incredibly successful program internationally. Ian and his work, having been trained in planning and landscape at Harvard, he went and founded a new department at Penn, and in which he essentially changed our field. He changed landscape architecture internationally to be organized more like a series of scientific disciplines around the table, shaping the metropolis with scientific knowledge. It's still a laudable goal. I still think it's a phenomenally significant, important piece of work. And yet it reached a dead end in our culture, not because we didn't have great GIS, not because we didn't have great data, great ecology, great knowledge. We have more scientific knowledge now than we could ever apply, ever interpret. This work hit a dead end for a generation of urbanists because we chose, by and large, not to plan our cities with this information. So in spite of having the greatest mapping in the world and having the greatest ecological lenses available, we've decided to allow our cities to be the resultant of economic and other forces rather than an act of design. And that's a broad statement, and I'm happy to unpack that and to disclaim it. And there are a few examples that we can talk about in which that doesn't apply. But what I want to suggest to you is that when Ian McHarg is doing these drawings for Staten Island in New York, we know exactly, and he knew precisely in the 1960s, where not to build. If you look at the post-Sandy map of people that were really devastated in Sandy, it maps exactly with this analysis. It's not rocket science. We know where not to build. And yet in our culture, post-Katrina New Orleans, post-Sandy Staten Island, we have a de facto right of return. It's almost impossible for a political leader in this culture to prevent a community or even an individual from returning and rebuilding in their community. And in that context, we could certainly talk about that if that's of interest to you, but a part of what that means, it's almost impossible to apply this kind of top-down regional ecological planning at a scientific level to the shape of the city. And so we have a generation of landscape urbanists, Adrian Heuss, Jim Corner, and others that I'll mention to you, who were trained in that ethos and in those skill sets of ecological analysis. They take the region as the unit of study, but yet they don't intervene at the scale of the region. That is, they're not planning the region because we've decided to not organize ourselves socially and politically to do so. Our economy has changed now to a neoliberal post-Fordist economy in which we're building cities, and we're building something at the scale of the project, and we're tending to build on sites that were formerly industrial sites. So landscape urbanism takes the ecological infrastructure, the kind of operating system of ecological planning, and then applies it to the scale of the brownfield site or the scale of the increment of urbanization is one way of thinking about that. And so we're still on Staten Island. This is Jim Corner, Fresh Kills landfill, the field operations project that's under construction just now. And it also is kind of prototypical of early 21st century landscape urbanist practice in the sense that you see these, this is a design development diagram from field operations, where they have these kind of actuarial tables of if you plant this and allow this to grow, and if you bring goats and do this over 25 years, what can you grow or what can you expect probabilistically will grow in that context. We also have, not only at the large scale of those brownfield remediations like Fresh Kills, the largest landfill on the planet, at the smaller boutique scale, in major metropolitan centers around the world, we're beginning to see, kind of the design scale of landscape urbanism as well. So you guys know a little bit maybe about the High Line or Millennium Park in Chicago. There are equivalents or examples in Europe and in Asia that we could talk about as well. In this regard, we have to think of the role of the landscape architect as constructing not only the public space of the High Line, but equally the development and air rights shifting around it to enable the urbanization alongside it. Right now, I would say that in North America, there are probably three really interesting examples to my mind. There's, there's Chicago and what they've been doing recently. There's Toronto, which we'll talk about in a minute. And there's New York. Certainly Bloomberg's New York has built some of the most, I think, seriously committed public spaces through landscape in the last decade. And it's not just the High Line. So, the Hudson River Piers, this is Michael Van Dockenberg, my colleague. Brooklyn Bridge Park, also Michael Van Dockenberg and Ken Greenberg, in which this new economy, this new return to the city demands destination environment. It demands public open space. It demands amenity, and is fueling urbanization not only in Manhattan and the meatpacking district, but equally in Brooklyn as well. It's changing, remediating a brownfield site and then making it available for public uses, but it's also changing our relationship to the East River and new species, new habitats, this kind of thing. In the North American context, for my part, probably the most interesting example is the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto has committed to the idea of the landscape architect as urbanist. They've hired half a dozen of the world's best landscape architects to reimagine their former industrial Portland sites. That's the kind of Portlands of Toronto, now under construction. And I thought I would share with you just two pieces of work from the last couple of years. This is, again, Adrien Heu's West 8. They won the design competition for the Central Waterfront, which you can see here. They were the only landscape-led team to be on the finalist list. There were 5 teams finalized, 4 of which were led by architects. Very good architects, did very interesting schemes. But I think it's not a coincidence that Adrien was the only team leader to argue that before this was an architectural problem, this is an ecological problem. And instead of showing destination architecture as the kind of lure, as many of the other schemes did, Adrien showed this diagram. And he said, when you recuperate the lacustrine ecology, that's the lake ecology, the fish habitat at the foot, and when you deal with stormwater management and flooding and recuperate the habitat for fish and other species, and you also have hydroelectric power serving heavy gauge transit in the trolley system, you have an ecological system and loop. And that we have to think of that as the basis of an urban design project. Whereas the other schemes focused on architectural object making or destination districts and a range of other interesting things. On top of that, Adrien and West 8 then organized a kind of urban design strategy. So what's interesting to me about Heu's and West 8 is that they are effectively working as urban designers, as are Michael Van Dockenberg, as are James Corner Field Operations, but they're doing it on an ecological basis, and they're getting ultimately to design. So much of this work is under construction. It's going in the ground, in the water in Toronto. Just to the east of that central waterfront, there was a design competition 2009, 2008 for the remediation of the mouth of the Don River. So the Don River is the eastern watershed of the City of Toronto. And the competition brief essentially is in these diagrams, taking a channel that had been inadequate for storm protection, for flooding, and tripling the amount of flood protection, rebuilding a functioning river mouth, and also, at the same time, juxtaposing that with the residents, new neighborhoods, new districts for 30,000 residents. In that regard, this design competition for me, as a brief, is among the most innovative I've seen in North America in recent years, and I think it's suggestive of what we can begin to see in the future, the reconciliation of ecological function with new urban districts. This is the winning scheme from Michael Van Dockenberg and Associates. They just this week got City Council approval to move the river, so this is going under construction now. It's an extraordinary piece of civil engineering to move a river. The important thing to understand here is that Van Valkenburg, of course, trained as a landscape architect, deeply immersed in the ecology, is the leader of a team in which ecological thinking is at the foundation. This river mouth, this estuary, is not being put back. It's not being put where it was historically. It's in a different place now. What's happening is, after a couple of decades of capacity building in conservation, restoration, landscape ecology, we now have the tools and techniques to be able to build a new functioning river mouth in a place where it had not been historically. They're working with Ken Greenberg, urban designer, Danish and Banish architects out of Stuttgart. So fashion-forward design, very interesting kind of position on very, very low energy. Some buildings or some districts having net zero energy, interesting district energy, a whole kind of green portfolio that I won't go into. But the idea that ecological function would be the foundation for that. Same design competition. One of the finalists, Chris Reed, his firm is called Stoss Landscape Urbanism. He's a member of our teaching team at the GSD and is a Boston-based landscape architect. His scheme for the same competition, that you can see here, the jury described as among the most ecologically leavened in the finalist list. In their brief, their proposal, Chris Reed described it as a sex park for fish. He begins with the species, in this case identifying the keystone fish species at the interface between river and lake, right? Having identified them, he figures out where they want to procreate and tries to engineer environments where they will be happy doing so. He then begins to hybridize the kind of civil engineering and the landscape ecology strategies. And a part of what Chris Reed is playing with here is that the fish don't have a cultural program, right? The fish want to express their DNA. They want to reproduce themselves, right? Like with the selfish genes that we want to reproduce ourselves. The fish don't have a cultural program. They don't need it to make it look new urbanist or gas lamps, right? It doesn't have to be brick for the fish. And so they're playing often, and certainly Reed is one example, where he's playing with the friction between ecological function, that is, how does it work for the fish to have sex, versus what does it look like culturally. And it's possible in some of this work, and I think much of this work, to see a position that's ecologically informed, biodiversity, growth, health, etc., but informed by contemporary design culture, for lack of a better formulation. There is an urban design strategy. There is a kind of zero energy or low energy strategy as well that I won't go into. Guys with me? So, what I thought I would do is just take a pause there and kind of let that settle down. I know it's a lot to throw at you, I apologize, but I've been driving a long way, so I have a lot to say. So that there are at least now 2 or 3 forks in the road that we can take, depending on what you would like to do. I have a piece in which I typically do at the end that focuses on these developments, these kinds of projects, but in East Asia, to talk about a kind of Chinese example, just as a kind of comparative thing. I also have a piece that's set up, if you want to do it, that talks about the training of a landscape architect today, which is more about what we're doing at the GSD. And I'm also set up to be able to kind of respond to what's actually on your minds more. Do you have any preferences about that? I mean, I can say a little bit more about what's going on at the GSD. So I've been there now 5 years. I'm still a part of the solution, not yet a part of the problem, touch wood. And so my mandate, or the mandate of our team, essentially has been to try to bring landscape pedagogy, the education of the landscape architect, up to speed with these realities. We've had, over the course of 110 years, what we think of as the foundational department and program in our field in the world. It has a great history, and at the same moment, it has, for a very long time, produced urbanists anyway. And yet, when I arrived, my sense of it was that its curriculum didn't always reflect that. If you saw what we did in core studios in the Department of Landscape Art, if you saw what we did in our core coursework, it hadn't always reflected the fact that we were producing urbanists as well. So we've reorganized our core. Among the key decisions that we've made is we've essentially doubled in size. We now have about 180 landscape architects in a 3-year graduate program overall, because we had been so niche and so small. The GSD has architecture, urban planning, urban design. We're about 900 students total. And if we didn't grow, if we were producing 25 landscape architects a year, we're just nowhere near the kind of global demand for our graduates. The second decision was to open up a 2-year program for architects to come into our landscape program. And so we are now about 50-50 civilians and architects coming in. And in that regard, we have a diverse array of civilians in our 3-year program that have not studied design. But we also have a very, very strong cohort of architects, mostly coming in with undergraduate and graduate degrees from around the world to study in a 2-year MLA. And so in that space, they join with the 3-year students. They do 1 year of our, what we call core, required courses in ecology, history theory, representation, and studio. And then in the final year, they do option studios, which is our euphemism for where all the students mix, basically. And so in that regard, thinking about the education of the landscape architect as urbanist has caused us to rethink the way that we focus on the education of our core commitments, our core studios. Is that interesting? You guys still with me? So in the fall of our second year, we have 36 or so, fine arts majors and people that have had 1 year of training in our first year, and they're joined by another 24 or so architects, and they mix, and they come into a studio that's led by my colleague Pierre Belanger, which is about using ecology as a lens to look at a very complicated brownfield site. In this case, it happens to be an abandoned military air base. And a part of what we're doing here is we're trying to mix the culture of architecture and landscape architecture to make it okay to be both and. So unlike the advice that I got as a student, which is don't talk to those people, look at the footwear that they're wearing, like that we actually can get along. We can actually talk to each other, and it's okay to be hybridized. The beginning of this studio, the front end, uses a set of tools and techniques that would be conventional in our field, that you would find in a lot of programs in terms of mapping, GIS, inventory. We have, of course, Richard Foreman, a world preeminent landscape ecologist on our faculty, and a range of others as well who teach with us. Where we get to in the studio, however, is to then look at the decommissioning and closure of military bases. We look at, storm track patterns. We look at a range of scales from 1 to 10 up to 1 to 1 million to try to expose architects to that kind of scalar thinking of landscape architecture, about systems. We look in great detail at plant material and plant communities. And we try to develop scenarios and strategies for intervening in these ecosystems. We spend quite a lot of time in the field. We go to cranberry bogs and we visit sites and we get to know the soils. And part of this has been to bring to the training of the landscape architect a sense of comfort level and fluency with digital media. I don't know where you guys are in that conversation. I was interested to find out that landscape architecture as a field has been, generally speaking, in most places, allergic to digital media. There's been a sense that that's really meant to be about the hand-eye-body connection and footwork, and okay, I understand that. And so when I arrived at the GSD 5.5 years ago, I was shocked to see in the first year we had really a kind of prohibition against the computer. We had one computer course in the entire core. It was a week on AutoCAD and a week on Adobe, and it wasn't really up to speed for the minimum kind of or entry level professional uptake, because I don't know here, but certainly my sense of the world is that most professionals work digitally. We work both analog and digitally, and so a part of what we needed to do, I felt, is to try to bring the landscape architect in their culture up to a fluency with these tools. And now these are tools that I think are pretty normative in many schools of architecture around the world. We're trying to correlate inputs of data from various forms, mostly about ecological flows, water flows, biota, subsurface conditions, geology, but then to correlate them to formal outcomes, because ultimately landscape architects, like architects, we're designers, right? We intervene in the world. We don't simply analyze and describe. And that has then allowed us to shape our projects through a series of 2- and 3-dimensional kind of modeling techniques and some milling. I'm not here to make great claims for the sophistication of this work, but what I want to suggest is that what's been normative in many schools of architecture in terms of running these tools has been really a cultural divide with landscape architecture. And if we're going to work together, in addition to eyewear and footwear and getting along, we also have to run the same software occasionally. We can do our own things as well, but ultimately we need tools that are relevant to our material and our media. And so we've built a series of workshops, and we've organized ourselves in such a way so as to be able to be productive in a way that not only is useful for our work, but that the other disciplines in the building can see as serious and relevant. Right? Because as long as we have access to ecology and design culture, we also need to be doing work that's really taken seriously by the other disciplines so that we can occupy that leadership position. In the spring semester of that second year, we then do a studio led by Chris Reed, my colleague who I mentioned earlier, runs this firm called STOS, Landscape Urbanism, which is introducing landscape architects to the shape of the city. So this brief for this studio is essentially the brief of the Lower Don competition in Toronto. It happens to be on a very complex river delta, a very contaminated brownfield site in New York for the last several years. And in this studio, we bring landscape architects into the study or continue the study of these complex systems, mostly hydrologically driven, occasionally then bringing them up against various species and habitats, and ultimately to landform, which is really the foundational act of the landscape architect, in my view. And through these studies of landform and land formation, we look at infrastructure and ultimately urban patterns, and we try to facilitate what, again, in most architecture programs is kind of conventional, the ability for the architect to describe and intervene in urban form. For the landscape architect, that's a shockingly new idea, actually, because in these kinds of typological studies of block structure, building height, building setback, the kind of thing that most architecture students around the world will have some exposure to in a studio here or there. Well, most programs will have an urban studio here, urban design studio occasionally. We're trying to bring the landscape architect up to fluency and capacity, so that, frankly, we can just play offense. Like if the urban design, urban planning programs have access to all the tools to describe urbanism, it's going to be quite challenging for us. And so we really want to be able to share those tools with our colleagues in the building. And in this regard, following that core and the ecology, technology courses and the drawing courses that supported the history theory courses, these students then go into a year of option studios or thesis where they choose what they want to work on. And at that point, we mix all the disciplines. So architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, urban design, they're all working on the same problems. And that allows us to be much more kind of in the world, much more looking at kind of problems and projects that are in the world, rather than just focusing on disciplinary formation. So I have a sense that might be a little bit inside baseball. I apologize for that, but it's a little bit of what I'm focused on day to day in terms of building a team and trying to shape the pedagogy of our field. And I'm more than happy to pursue questions about that if there's interest in that. What I thought I would close with was a sense of where these tools and techniques intersect and where the field is going, if I could. And I want to touch on some international examples. You can see examples of this kind of work on every continent, save Antarctica today. Right? It's a global discourse. You can see manifestations of this across the world. But I'm primarily focusing on North America here. I thought I would close with a couple of examples from an East Asian condition, just because it's such a different and pressing interest here. Two projects briefly from the recent history in Shenzhen, China. Shenzhen is a city that is on the mainland. It is the sister city, the mainland sister city to Hong Kong. In the 1970s, it was a fishing village of a few thousand people. It happened to be, proximate to Deng Xiaoping's openings, the four modernizations, and so it became a kind of liberal zone for economic growth. And the Central Party has the idea of growing Shenzhen to be equal in size economically and politically with Hong Kong. It's a hedge against Hong Kong independence. And at the same moment, Shenzhen is growing very, very rapidly. Last time I was there, 20 million, 25 million, I forget the number. The first project I'll show you is a recent design competition for the port of Qinghai, which is the port that's been up for about 15 years, I think, in Shenzhen. It's now obsolete or soon to be obsolete, and replaced with a new CBD and residence for 1 million people. So just a new piece of city for 1 million. This is the plan of James Corner Field Operations, which was the winning scheme. The short list was interesting to me. The short list of the three finalists, first, second, third prize, were James Corner Field Operations, Rem Koolhaas OMA, Joan Busquets, urban planner from Barcelona. And if you looked at their diagrams, you would see very, very clear similarities, because all three projects, even though one was from a landscape architect, one was from an architect, one was from a planner, all three projects began with the same diagram, which was to recuperate the 5 fingers of river that you see coming into the bay, right? I don't want to suggest that this is now internationally the case, but in this particular project, what I found interesting was that the CBD for 1 million new people, all of these people agreed on the basic foundational diagram, and I think rapidly these techniques are being absorbed into architecture and planning. I don't want to make any claims for the kind of semi-disposable generic kind of CBD, which is really outside the control of Corner and Field Operations. But what I want to point to is the idea of recuperating the health of the rivers and their tributaries as refueling the health of the bay is kind of foundational to the construction of this new city. And that for me is indicative of, again, a major urban project led by a landscape architect or a landscape urbanist in this case over the last couple of years. Also in Shenzhen, a couple of years ago, a design competition for a piece of the city called Longgang City. This was smaller, not 1 million, but several 100,000. International design competition. The list that I saw in the jury was ultimately 16 teams competed. And I'm showing you the winning scheme by the collaborative called Ground Lab. That's Eva Castro, Alfredo Ramirez, Eduardo Rico. They all teach in the AA Landscape Urbanism Unit in London. And so it's a landscape urbanist project, and it comes out of their research. They looked at this site, as did the other competitors, which was a kind of classic Hutong to be tabula rasa erased in favor of new development. This team won by doing two things that were remarkable compared to their other peers. The first thing that they did, which is shown here, is they said, well, hold on, you can't simply erase the cultural heritage of the building fabric of this place without having some form of interpretation. And increasingly, you can see, whether it's the High Line in New York or in projects like this, there's a very strong alliance that's emerged in the last decade between landscape urbanism and questions of cultural heritage and preservation. We've just launched the GSD, a program in critical conservation. We have a great deal of interest, that is Mohsen and I and Rem and others, in the idea of conservation as a framework and how to think it through relative to the preservation of historic fabric, heritage, etc. In this context, they were the only one of 16 finalist entries to do so, and to be smart enough to say, coming off a plane from London, we're not the people to tell you what to say. We need a process, we need interpretation, which is a professional process to decide what to keep. The second thing that they did should be, by now, no surprise to you. They chose the river as the primary spatial element of the recuperation of this piece of Longgang City, which is among the foulest kind of industrial Chinese rivers you could imagine. But through a series of ecological strategies to recuperate the health of the river, proposed landscape typologies looking to history. And then on top of that landscape foundation, then look at building heights, block structure, building setbacks, solar orientation, and the like. The traditional métier of the urban designer, I want to suggest, is still with us, but it's most often then looked at in the context of the ecological goals established at the beginning of the project. So in this case, precedent study, you're looking at Cerdà's plan for Barcelona, or looking at solar orientation or modeling of energy. This is done in relationship to targets and really a kind of a set of goals that are established by the landscape ecologist or the landscape urbanist. Perhaps the most interesting thing that this team did, and by far the most political aspect of their work, was each of the finalist teams was invited to build a huge model of this piece of the city. And they all dutifully did. There were 15 of them, these big kind of acrylic and plywood constructions of the shape of the city. Essentially, you've seen these briefs in which, the city comes down to a kind of beauty contest on shape, and this form looks good, and this means this. And the team coming off the plane from the AA in London said, no, you can't be serious. You're going to build a new district for 250,000 people, and you're going to build this over the next 10 years, and you're going to build it with a balsa wood model. This is just not serious. And they proposed this model, which they referred to as a relational urban model, or you might think of it as a parametric urban model or an associative urban model. They think of it as an Excel spreadsheet. Right? On the left, you can see building heights from very low buildings up to mid-rise buildings. On the right, you can see density targets, FAR and density targets. And at the bottom, you can see a kind of typology or a DNA code of different building or block typologies. This team argued that using this associative or parametric model, the shape of the city should be correlated to the desirable goals, the outcomes that are at hand. The empirical goals, that is, measurements of energy usage, water volume, measurements of solar orientation or solar gain, building height and shadow. So correlating urban form to ecological performance at full stop. That's the promise of this kind of model. And in that regard, the Shenzhen Planning Bureau was persuaded that, in fact, questions of building form and block structure could, in fact, be shaped by that, and that might be a more probative, more informed way of working. And it might actually lead to a more ecologically healthful and socially just, potentially, city, in the sense that this was the only team that proposed that the model work would necessarily require a conversation. Our hosts in the Shenzhen Planning Bureau were a little bit puzzled as to who to talk to because they were planning on evicting all the people that were living in the Sutong fabric. Having said that, the idea that it would require a conversation about, well, what are our goals? Is it certain species? Is it solar orientation? Is it net zero energy? What is the ecological driver? And that would ultimately become a social or maybe even a political conversation, is something that they had as an aspiration, at least. For my part, I believe that this form of modeling, correlating urban outcomes very precisely through performative measures to ecological aspirations, is really at the forefront of this kind of work. And I believe that it will continue to inform the ecological urbanism or landscape urbanism project for many years to come. So thanks very much for coming out, and I'll look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you for the introduction and walking us through the history and through the computations that you will be seeing. This may be a naive question, but what would be an example of an actual project that is being done or is being developed that you want to keep an eye on?
Sure.
Your opinions on that?
Yeah. Well, as I said, for me, the two most interesting right now that are under construction right now are the Waldhein city and the Qinghai projects in Shenzhen and the lower Dan and Toronto. I mean, those two for me are the most interesting because they really get at urban form and shovels are in the ground.
And I have a second question related to that. In all the discussion about...
Hold on. Hey, guys. Either leave quietly or...
Don't leave. There's still happening. There's still
There's
a lot
a
going on.
conversation after the lecture. Welcome to architecture school.
Please.
Yeah. When we look at these schemes, it still seems to me at least it's almost like monumental when I look at Urbanism, which is certainly not what is...
Did you say Corbusian?
Yeah. At least that's the image I get from looking at this. And that was one of the reason why I'm asking this question, because I'm really trying to find out what it will be when we talk about traditional stuff like scale,
Sure.
like the human factors, Jane Jacobs. Those kinds of ideas are not jettisoned, is it?
So, excellent questions. So as I said earlier, we're in a kind of what my friend Andres Duani has described as an operational phase. That is, we're getting stuff in the ground, and that's interesting and productive. And we have, I would say, three main kinds of work that you can look at. We have very, very large brownfield toxic remediation projects like Fresh Kills or many, many others like that, in which it's primarily recreational amenity, biodiversity, habitat, and there is some urbanization, but it's primarily a large brownfield site that's being remediated. The second area that we have these, I'm calling them boutique, and that's not exactly right, but I don't have a better formulation this evening. These kind of, destination set piece design pieces like Millennium Park in Chicago, or the High Line or others. And so I think of it that way, that those are at two ends of the same economic transformation to post-Fordism, basically. In the wake of industry, we basically have two problems, among other things. We have very large industrial sites that are now opened up and are brownfield and need to be remediated. And at the same moment, we need lures for new kinds of destination urbanity. And they're both coming out of landscape urbanist agenda, but they take different forms. One's in the old city as a lure for urbanization. The other is outside the city or on the edges of. Another thing that we could say is that this work is only relevant, I think, when you need a model of urbanization. And that seems self-evident, and I don't mean to be coy about that, but to back up a minute, you only need this work if you're urbanizing. You know, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we're not urbanizing. We've been down-zoned to zero, and I can't have a chicken coop, you know. So we don't need a model of urbanism. We're done, right? And so places that are shrinking very rapidly and places that are growing very rapidly, so think of Detroit and Shenzhen, China, they need, I think, theories and models of urbanization, because the ones that we have available to us, the old toolkit, let's say, have often, not always, but often proved inadequate. And so I think of it as supplementary to that, you know, if you're working in Harvard Square or if you're working in a set piece, you know, we have a lot of tools. We've learned a lot, you know, we've learned a lot over the course of the last century. And at the same moment, those tools are really challenging when you try to deal with a modern airport. We did a conference on airports last year at the GSD because I think to deal with the contemporary airport is a central challenge in our cities. And you know, I don't think Jane had a position on airports. I don't think you can build an airport out of stoops. Let's put it that way. Eyes on the street, you know, defensible space is not going to help us. So, and I don't mean to be, you know, kind of just making light of that, but I do think I'm a part of a generational cohort of academics who have revisited the Jane Jacobs, Robert Moses debates. And in that cohort, I would put Sarah Whiting down at Rice, Hashim Sarkis now down the street at MIT, Keller Easterling. We're all more or less of the same generation, but each one of us have found within modernism, within modernist planning practice, a kind of recuperation. And I don't want to talk about Corbusier per se because it's not really the subject of my research, but I would give you Ludwig Hilbersheimer, because we've essentially been taught that the failures of modernism were ultimately architectural failures. And my research suggests, in looking at Hilbersheimer, that there was a strain within modernist planning, the best examples of it, which aspired to both social equity and environmental health. Now, the form that it takes is different than density. And in fact, Hilbersheimer proposed the decentralization and the dedensification that would come not through a design decision, because we don't get to decide that, but through industrial economy. And so, as you know, Sarah Whiting looks at the superblock, or Keller Easterling looks back at Mackay, or Hashim Sarkis looks at Matt urbanism. All of us are looking back at those debates and saying, well, yeah, mistakes were made, but hold on. I mean, at least in the modernist project there was a social agenda, and at least there was a green agenda. And I'm not saying that mistakes weren't made. They were. We wouldn't do it this way again. But having said that, I'm frustrated because my generation has been given what I think of as a false choice. We were invited, or at least I was invited, to either choose to have architectural culture on the one hand, in which case we could have, cultural visibility, we can have, maybe even profitability and cultural valence, but we have to give over the city as responsible for, the social to planning and the environmental to ecology. At the same moment, if you chose to work on the city, you essentially were obliged to adopt a set of neo-traditional 19th century agendas about, and in certain contexts, that may be perfectly appropriate. But in the context of places that are shrinking rapidly or growing rapidly by virtue of economic conditions, I find those tools often are rapidly outstripped. And so these are almost all very, very large cities, right? We're talking about New York, Chicago, Toronto. New York and Toronto are the best examples in North America. They share a couple of characteristics. They are the largest city, respectively, in the US and in Canada. They are the house of their particular financial industries. They have robust housing markets. There is enormous pent-up demand for housing growth, and they also have enormous brownfield sites. And so that configuration produces the need for hundreds of thousands of new units. It's not at the scale of the neighborhood. It's not at the scale of the block or the district. So I hope that's helpful.
Industrial economies shaping cities. And I was wondering about some of the radically successful economies part of that cities that they're generally vulnerable to ecological systems. I was wondering if you could the relationship between climate change and ecology.
Sure, yeah. Great question. I have not been to Jakarta. I'm making my first trip to Mumbai in 2 weeks. For me, I read a guy called David Harvey. David Harvey is a theorist who often, in his earlier work, would connect postmodernism in the arts and culture to economic changes. Right? So his writing on postmodernism was the first example that I saw where he was explaining postmodernism in the arts or postmodernism in architecture as not just an autonomous stylistic work of we decided in this room, let's do a certain style, but in fact in relationship to structural changes in the economy. And so based on that, I now use that as a kind of framework sort of to understand. Another useful person in this regard is, again, Hilbersheimer, because Hilbersheimer, even though he was a committed socialist his whole career, he was basically citing people on the far right, people who were driving the economy, saying the industrial economy will shape the city, and planning and architecture, our arts follow after that. That is, Hilbersheimer's footing, and I think it's helpful for us today, is not that design can resist those macroeconomic forces. Hilbersheimer's formulation in my terms is design and planning can insulate populations from their worst outcomes, right? Which is what he does in his project in Lafayette Park, Detroit. But there's never a moment when we're in the room to make those decisions, right? And so that means that we, have to be, I think, have a level of humility about what design can do, and as opposed to the kind of build it and they will come, hubris of design culture, the idea that, industrial economy is one set of forces, a little bit like dealing with, natural disaster or ecological flows. They're media for us to work with, let's say, rather than things for us to control. And so in that regard, our intellectual history is important here, because I've been educated, I think many of us have been educated, to think of urbanization as against nature, right? We have this long-standing cultural tradition of thinking of culture, cities, as opposed to nature, right? It's this or that. And that binary has not been very productive, I think, for our fields recently. And so landscape urbanism has been an attempt, and I think ecological urbanism is as well, to actually say, well, no, after Henri Lefebvre, the entire planet has been urbanized. There's not a molecule of carbon on the planet that has not seen the effects of urbanization. And as you say, in places that are rapidly urbanizing or places that are rapidly shrinking, I would add, we see enormous social and environmental impact. But my belief is that there are, models that we can build to make better environmental and social outcomes through design, and to not simply imagine that urbanization is opposed to the natural process.
Really, I think a brilliant argument for the activity, and I really appreciate that. Like you said, I really appreciate the introduction. One of the people that you mentioned, I like to underline this, one of the people you mentioned briefly, Adolphe Valfond, working for Haussmann, Les Promenades de Paris, which talks about actually, in my opinion, an integrated model where the ecology is seen as just as important, the sort of land ecology is seen as just as important as utilities. In fact, it's probably one of the best examples of somebody who is working to try to meet the very aspects of the question that was just asked in terms of economic growth, densification, and yet trying to use a particular technology. Now, the first half of that book is a series of gardens, which were indeed the way in which that was the technology. The concept there was that if you had certain kinds of requirements, you might pick this kind of garden. Why? Because it has very specific structure, which not just about being picturesque or about being the right kind of form, but actually fitting the right kind of ecology. I think one of the problems we have today, because that was clear to everybody, for two reasons. One is that France is its whole nation is a cultivated landscape, and has been for actually hundreds of years. And the second reason is because actually at that point in time, because of the condition of Paris, all of those things made sense. And also because they had a very clear political structure at that point.
Clear is a nice way of putting it. It's true. Yeah.
So the problem is we don't have that clear political structure. And so
I was with you.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Or maybe we have a political structure that's just going in the other direction.
Yeah.
The thing I'm actually quite intrigued by the idea that we might write code, for want of a better term, which is not form-based code, but indeed is performance-based code, which has to do with the ecological performances appropriate to that place in a somewhat McCartney sense. So I really like that. But the thing, and maybe this is, back to that question, is, okay, how do we develop the political incentive? And how do we begin to capture the kind of tools we need in this country? In Paris, they have the zone de management contrôlé, so they can actually create an office for the people who live there. They can actually create a way of thinking about these kinds of issues. All we have is capitalism and the sort of the land-grant potential difference. Do you see a way of kind of integrating this kind of logic and technique into our kind of...
It's really well put, and I agree. Apart from the idea of having a clearer, more top-down political structure, which I'll pause for a moment and say, let's talk about that one. I think it's absolutely true that the so-called Haussmannization, Alphon's work, is an absolute key precedent to this interest. It comes out of a tradition of the École de Pont-et-Chaussée, among other things, of civil engineering in France that's very long-standing. If you want to read about this, there's a guy called Joseph Desponzio at Columbia, who's an historian, among other things, who's written about this. And he cites the work of an interesting guy called Varé, who was working at the turn of the 19th century. And he was trained as both an engineer at the École de Pont-et-Chaussée, civil engineer in today's parlance, but also as an architect and a painter of landscapes. And he claims, Desponzio claims, that it was Varé who first used the title architect-paysagiste, meaning landscape painter, and brought his work as an engineer to the integration of these things. Now, he was working on not Alphondish kind of projects, but that's where the title came from. And it is true that over the course of the 19th century in Paris, you see, and in particular in the second half, projects that look a lot like our contemporary interest in infrastructure in relationship. Now, the distinctions that I would draw, they may strike you as quibbles, and I'm prepared to live with that. On the one hand, they came out of a tradition of civil engineering that was quite robust and didn't lead to the formation of landscape architecture as a profession. When landscape architecture was established finally in France, it was after the fact, after it came back from the US. At the same moment, the relationship between the parks and gardens you describe and the overall, what we would call today, the metabolism of the urban fabric is something that I think we can now see from our perspective today. But at the same moment, I think we have to situate in the context in which it was done and the claims that were made about it. The other distinction that I would draw is the one you mentioned at the end about the political context. So for my part, what I'm interested in here is that most of these examples, let's set aside the Chinese as a kind of outlier for just now, but the North American, European examples, they tend to go through extra planning mechanisms. That is, the traditional mechanisms of planning are robust and available in New York and Toronto and elsewhere, and yet these projects, the ones that I'm referring to in this canon, they tend to go around that. And they take different forms. Toronto's a weak mayor culture, New York is a relatively strong mayor, Chicago had been, the son of the czar, basically. And so there's this interesting, to my mind, weird mix of capital development rights for housing brownfield sites that have pent-up value, but have to be unlocked because they're not so easily remediated and the infrastructure costs a lot of money, combined with some form of political leadership, usually late in the project, and some form of private philanthropy for design and arts and culture. That mix produces Millennium Park, the High Line, Fresh Kills, a range of other things. And to a project, they didn't go through the planning mechanisms traditionally. And there's an interesting comma there about, well, what does that mean politically for us? You know that the High Line was, slated to be demolished by the Giuliani administration as an impediment to development. And it was at a community meeting discussing the timetable for demolition that two community members met and decided, well, somebody's got to do something. And, if Robert De Niro comes to your community meeting, it's a special community. But when they connected that to an agenda for private philanthropy and they raised money at the scale of a museum, right, at that point, and it's not a one-off. I see it around the world now where private philanthropy, development capital, and some form of political leadership. In Toronto, the case is that you have half of its publicly owned land. And my friends, my Canadian planner friends on the left, I love them, but they say, how dare the city sell public land, public utility in perpetuity for the development of the waterfront? And the response to my planners, friends who are moderates, is that that's the only way that we know how to develop in our culture. Because development, even in China, is neoliberal private capital. That's the mechanism to increment. And I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on that, but I do think that there's a conversation to be had about how we develop cities. And if you're in a context where you want a city that has greater ecological performance, better public space, et cetera, the best examples I've seen go around the planning bureaucracy. They tend to they leverage the value in the land, the brownfield land, by unlocking it through a range of different mechanisms. They bring private philanthropy that demands design culture, so you have some off-site design talent with name recognition. And they tend to expect a kind of high-performing environmental profile as well. So that's at least a sketch of a response. So I think there was somebody here, yeah.
You earlier talked about Ian Park and how we kind of chose not to act on how he would have us do the design. But again, you also talked about the binary of how you were misinformed about your choice, either be with the architects or with the landscapists. Is it that, can we say that was the case with Ian Park too? Because he, in designing with nature, he's basically against building. So the choice not to go with what he said, couldn't that be down to there was no building? It was one-sided. It was too biased on one side rather than.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I have a slightly more nuanced reading of his project. I will grant you, and what I have said, what I have put in print, is that it was much better as an epistemology, as a set of tools, as a methodology. It's much better at telling us where not to urbanize. Full stop. And it's great at that, actually. It's to date, very, very helpful. Having said that, on the question of knowing that we're going to urbanize in the places where we can, it's not nearly as helpful about how we should in fact urbanize. And I think that's a part of its own particular historic genealogy, its development. Having said that, I do think of McHarg as an urbanist. He did study planning in addition to landscape at Harvard. He is, in fact, if you look at his work, doing projects for urbanization. Now, he happened to be at a moment where he was working in a couple of contexts. He was working in a context of decentralization and sprawl. Most or many of his projects in North America were suburban in nature. And I don't know if Staten Island counts as a suburb or not, but certainly, the projects that we know of in North America that got realized are. And he was also working with the expectation of a public sector that was robust as a kind of referee of the game, let's say. And so in that regard, I would say that you're right that, it's much better telling us where not to build. And that's still like a good thing to do, But it seems remarkably difficult in our social political context. So I think there was somebody over here.
I was just wondering, it's like a curiosity that I have. What about cities that are coastal cities? Like they don't happen to be operable in a way. I was just wondering what kind of context will we see in urbanism? Like, is it an urban situation there?
What kind of cities? Did you say sim cities?
Ghosted cities.
Ghosted cities?
Cities are like built with nobody lives there. There's some construction that's I don't know, I was just wondering if you consider that as like urban context.
Sure. I mean, if I take the meaning of the question, my first exposure to the topic was my first teaching job was at the University of Michigan, and I happened to spend time going to Detroit and starting to do some work on Detroit, and it became pretty clear, that in the implosion of Detroit or any other major industrial city that's depopulating, the old toolkit was just not helpful. Like if the answer was we have to build more buildings more densely and have more people, that's not going to help Detroit because the people aren't coming back. So if you have an economic model that is decentralizing and people are leaving for a whole variety of reasons that are not architectural, building more architecture seems not the right tool, right? And so that was my first radicalization. Like, wow, we need a new toolkit, and wouldn't it be helpful to have something like landscape that would be, in a context which is spreading, in which population densities are going down, and given that it seems unlikely that architecture will reverse that trend of its own, of its own accord. And that's a part of what started me, being interested in landscape, is the idea that, in places that are depopulating, buildings are a very blunt instrument, and they're useful and helpful in many, many contexts, but not all. And certainly, places that are rapidly shrinking, places that are rapidly growing, I think we need different kinds of tools.
Thanks for the snapshot on the evolution of the landscape architecture program in the JSC. Hopefully other programs far and wide are looking at that. I'm really interested in that linking of ecological performance to development models is interesting because it goes into what we might call an old world of planning mentality, more about economics than design. Clearly there's a big design culture. I'd be curious to hear you talk about how that design culture is initiated. What's the foundation of it? And what are the building blocks of that foundation?
So you guys probably heard that. The question's about the backstory on how landscape architects are educated is interesting. Can we talk a little bit about the application of performance metrics and not just a plannerly framework? I think the division of labor used to be between planning and landscape architecture. After the 1930s, as planning became its own field, it was primarily responsible for the shape of the city, right? It was spatial, it was projective, it was both regulatory and policy based, but also a design field in a way. Post 1968, broadly in North America, planners were radicalized around social agency and social justice, and they viewed often architects and design culture as handmaidens to fascism and a part of the problem. And that meant that our planning program went to the Kennedy School and became social science and policy and all the things that I think have happened around North America. Overwhelmingly, planning culture in the academy views design as the problem, right? I mean, my planning friends in Toronto tell me their job on a daily basis is to protect communities from design. And I think if you have, post-Jane Jacobs, right? If that's the ethos for 40 years, if you're inculcated in the sins of our modernist fathers, and if we keep flagellating ourselves over that, and we produce a generation or two or three of planners who view their job as basically stopping development. And I understand that. I mean, I don't want to prejudice their value system. I think that they mean it. But you see a generational shift where that produced this void into which landscape architects have stepped. But it was weird at the beginning because these were landscape architects who didn't necessarily get design culture in their first education, right? Ian McHarg's program that Jim Corner studied at Penn was not really fashion forward in terms of design culture. Adrian Huss studying at Wageningen got natural sciences. He didn't get design culture, right? And so it was by people like that, or Michael van Valkenburg growing up on a dairy and then studying in some very good landscape programs. They started with ecology, but then they grew into design culture, is what I would say. And it's that weird crosswire of two things that shouldn't be sorted together, like the peanut butter chocolate thing. I'm dating myself with the Reese's peanut butter thing, but like that combination of two things that shouldn't go together, that crosswire is what sparked this 15 years ago. So for us, it's much easier for us to bring in and build a culture of design culture in the school because that's been our history. It's tougher for us to bring people in from the natural sciences or the social sciences. And so we tend to bring in more architects, we tend to bring in people with BFAs in painting and just graphic design. We do bring in some civilians. We have a real hard time with the philosophy majors for whatever reason. Like it's all meta. They want to talk about what a brief is and what it means. And so what we do is we have a very strong first-year program that begins with precedent, projective geometry, and you would find it quite prescriptive. The students are unburdened by a lot of choice in 2 years. It's highly evolved, and it's kind of old school teaching. It's like really highly evolved briefs, very strong brief culture, and in that context, in the context of the GSD, you can't help but get at least inoculated to design culture because you're swimming in it. To that, I guess the other thing that I would say is that we do have people that do dual degrees with planning, and there's a lot of crossover there as well. But the division of labor now in the building, whereas it used to be that planners dealt with planning of the city and large-scale territories and landscape architects did gardens, the division of labor now is I think of planning as a kind of social conscience and policy infrastructure, but we're the designers across scales. And that division of labor is still shaking itself out, but I think it's probably where we'll be for the next several years. Are you guys too publicly ashamed to ask me questions? Is this part of a class requirement that you have to do this?
No, not really. Well, I'm very thankful for your presentation because I'm in the practice of the landscape program. And I'm teaching landscape and the regional landscape planning with the focus of ecological research. My background is actually ecological biology. And here are all students from the department of this. So I give a lot of timely and inspiring opportunities for to learn about this. My question is about along the scale, regional scale, and regional plane. So how do you see ecological urbanism or landscape urbanism as a medium to reshaping or reconfiguring the needs of not particularly singular site? So we have been characterized by urban sprawl and development, right? So is there any point where Bloom and Federer or Mr. Architect to integrate with that kind of establishment?
Sure, yeah, I think it's a central question. And I think there are a lot of different answers in different contexts and a lot of people doing a lot of interesting work in different fields. But before talking about the region, I want to talk a little bit about biology, right? So you guys know ecology is this 19th century Germanic science of species in relationship to their environments that came out of biology, right? And it's a natural science originally. In the 20th century, especially post-68, that became more complicated because it implicated the human species in the model, right? So in the 19th century formation, we meant other species, not us, because we were special. By the time you get to the second half of the 20th century, we're implicated in the model, right? We're embedded in the ecology that we're describing. We're both imagining it as a system, but also in it itself. And then more recently, by the 90s, you have people describing ecology as a kind of epistemological framework or a form of human subjectivity. So as a term and as a field, it's gotten quite interesting and complex, and we might now talk about the biopolitical, right? We might talk about the relationship between biology or ecology and the space of politics and not just the natural science. Having said that, there is still a natural science there. We have departments of organismic and evolutionary biology, including ecologists at Harvard and other places. And I'm interested in the fact that design disciplines and sciences sit very uncomfortably with each other. Just very, very uncomfortably. And I'm glad that you guys are here because I'm hopeful that we'll be able to recuperate some kind of a rapprochement between, people in this room and people that are doing the work that you're doing. I do believe on some level that we're engaged in fundamentally and utterly different work. I think you're producing knowledge through scientific method, among other things. I believe that we're intervening in the world. Right? And if you go to conferences as I do of ecologists and designers, often the ecologists will begin the first day by presenting their study of regions and sites and issues, and most often they conclude with the desire to publish their findings and needing more sites to study. We need more data, which one could not agree with, because their model is the scientific model. They want to hypothesize, falsify, test, build model, publish data, because what you're doing is you're producing, I don't know what you're doing, but what biology is doing is it's producing knowledge about the world through the scientific method. The second day, an architect steps to the podium and says, I'm going to China on Tuesday, I need help now. Our training, our métier is to intervene in the world. And that's utterly different than the scientific method. And so I want to acknowledge that. I don't think it's impossible that we get along and talk to each other. But I want to just acknowledge that, because too often, and I don't mean you nice folks, but generalizing in my experience, people coming from the high sciences tend to view us as in the decorative arts. We're kind of look and feel, it's paint colors and fashion, and I like those boots, those are nice, and okay, I know to an outsider, design culture does look a little bit like a Ouija board, it's kind of a little opaque, but at the same moment, we do think design matters, and we think that if you want to execute cities that are more ecologically healthful or functioning, you better damn well have design central to that, and in a way that biology hasn't helped us for. So I'm interested in that conversation between the biological sciences, broadly ecology. Specific to the region, there are a lot of interesting people doing work at different scales. And there are a lot of regional projects around the world that one could point to, and there's good work being done there. I focused on the kind of urban district, brownfield site scale tonight. Ecological urbanism as a broad rubric is kind of expanding the scale. On the one hand, my colleague Neil Brenner at Harvard is in the planning faculty, social urban theorist, is interested in what he calls planetary urbanization, which is an Henri Lefebvre formulation that argues that we are effectively planetarily urbanized, right? And I don't mean, what was the Star Wars? I don't mean Coruscant. I don't mean like the whole city is looking like Manhattan. But what I mean by that is that every aspect of the globe, in terms of its oxygen, its carbon, its temperature, is urbanized. At the other end of the scale, we have very small projects that work at a very small kind of material, even nano scale. At Harvard, there is this Wyss Institute for Biomimicry. It's doing a lot of really interesting work looking at the biological in relationship to design and material. And so looking at that scale and knowing that ecology can work and think across those scales is helpful and productive for us. Landscape urbanism is really focusing on building urban pieces, urban fragments, or urban districts on brownfield sites. And that means we study the ecology at the scale of the region, but we then apply at the scale of the site that we're intervening upon. And as I said before, in most of these contexts, we've lacked the instruments, let's say, to really design at the scale of the region. Is that helpful? Is that okay? Sure. Thanks for coming. Yeah, maybe one more, and I'm available to chat if you guys have more specific things, but I think we should probably let you guys go back to your lives.
But I just wanted to maybe comment on something that you just said about the differentiation between the ecologist's role in the scientific method versus the designer's kind of more manipulative and urban form. And one of the things that's key in that component or that conversation is you said the word data and the ability to acquire information by raw data and spreadsheets and the like and the scientific method. And I see people like Ava Castro and a few others are trying to tackle that position of information and how information gets inserted into a system and put it and acknowledged as influential in the design decision-making processes that we see outputs of these things. So maybe maybe if you could speak just a little bit to the role of data and information in regards to the designer. We clearly know how that plays out in the scientific method.
Sure, yeah. Scott Cohen, the most recently chair of architecture at Harvard, said recently, architecture no longer is interested in representation. They don't really deal with representation. They have data, and they have fabrication, and they have projects. And my jaw, and it was just like 2010, and my jaw hit the floor. I was like, wow. I can't even imagine landscape without representation, because in my own, intellectual formation, landscape, is fundamentally bound up in picture making. And so we have a tradition in landscape that's long-standing and is with us to this day of making, scenographic views of. That's rapidly being flanked by the idea of embedding knowledge or data or information or responsivity or forms of intelligence or responsiveness into the model itself. And this is something architects have been doing for some time now, is basically bringing information, performative measures and other things into the model itself. And so if you talk to architects who do that kind of work, they're less and less interested in what it looks like, and they're more and more interested in how it performs. And they're more and more, many of them are looking at models from the natural world in which, matter is self-forming, right? That the matter itself has a kind of logic or a kind of intelligence. And that work is interesting for us, but we're nowhere near that right now. We're really playing catch up. In this associative or parametric modeling, we are in our core, in our options, in our work, we are beginning, trying to embed information, I would say, even if not data, embed forms of intelligence or responsiveness into these things. But it's going to take us some time. It's still very early days. I would say that one of the challenges is that we have so much information, obviously, right? I mean, this is a very different, when the Harvard GSD wrote a grant to the Ford Foundation in 1965 for $1 million, and they were funded. And with this, they founded the Lab for Computer Graphics, and in which they invented GIS. At that time, their principal problem was to take a lot of information, cartographic information, ecological, scientific information, and to spatialize it. And so they had to build that tool. Absolutely game-changing innovation. We had a 375th anniversary a couple of years ago at Harvard, and they asked every school for their top game-changing ideas in 375 years. The GSD's only been there for 75, so it was a shorter list. The university then published a top 10 list of the top 10 game-changing ideas that have come out of the university in 375 years. This is kind of, not being a Harvard guy, before I got there, I thought, oh, Jesus, that just sounds arrogant to me. So they published this list. It includes things like anesthesia for surgery, the case study method, parliamentary, electoral processes, the catcher's mask, like a whole series of wow, I can't even imagine, And the GSD got one thing on that list, the invention of GIS, which is an absolute game changer globally. It changed the world. And it addressed the problem that they faced, which was how to spatialize and share information. And I think we face a very, very different problem right now, which is we have so much more scientific knowledge, so much more data on any site that we look at than we could ever possibly interpret. And most often I find it challenging because the presumption is that our responsibility as designers is to take the truth and to manage all of it. And I don't think that's our métier. I don't think it's our responsibility, in fact, because intervening in the world, our challenge is to make a better world and to be clear about by what measures. And those measures are important to be data rich and informed, but at the same moment, it's not the responsibility of taking all that we know. And so in that regard, I think I could see us in the next 5 or 10 years as a field looking more like architecture, embedding responsiveness and intelligence in the model itself. But ultimately, we will have to be projected and propositioned about how to be for better. You guys have been very nice to stay this long, so thanks for coming out.
Thanks.